Okay, so you need to solve a sine, cosine, or tangent right triangle trig problem. So I've noticed that one of the hardest things for people is deciding which one to use, and then the other thing is like deciding which side is which is related to that. So let's jump right in here. So first of all, if you're doing one of these problems, you have to have a right triangle, unless you're splitting another triangle up into right triangles, and then you're working with a right triangle anyway. So now to deal with that, you have to make sure you know where is your 90-degree located, and then you need to know at least one of the other two angles. Now, if you know one of the other two, you could actually find the other one since the angles in a triangle add up to 180, but you need to at least know what one of them is. And you just need to pick one of them to use as your reference angle. Because all of this, when we're talking about things like opposite and adjacent, we're talking about them relative to something else. Like opposite is opposite of something. Opposite to what? Well, to whatever angle you are going to be referencing from. So that's one of the important things, is you need to pick an angle to reference from. Let's do that now by saying that we're going to use this 25-degree angle as our reference angle. Now, to solve the problems, you're also going to need to know at least one of the other sides. Now, if you knew two of the sides in a right triangle and you wanted to know the other one, you would just do the Pythagorean theorem. A squared plus b squared equals c squared. Or in other words, leg squared plus leg squared equals hypotenuse squared. So make sure it's not one of those problems. If you only know one side though, you're trying to find the other one, you know it's a right triangle, and you know one of the other angles, then you're probably doing a sine, cosine, or tangent right triangle trig problem. Okay, but how do we actually do it? Let's jump in. So the main thing to notice here is that you need to decide whether it's sine, cosine, or tangent. And the way to do that is that, well, each of those is a ratio between two sides. There are three sides in a triangle, and you can pair them up three ways. You could pair up the opposite with the hypotenuse, and people named that something. They named that sine. You could pair up the adjacent with the opposite, and get that ratio, and that would be called tangent. And you could pair it up this way, hypotenuse with adjacent, and if you do that, the hypotenuse paired up with the adjacent is cosine. Okay, so that's what these actually are. They're just names for which two sides you're pairing up, and you use it to tell your calculator which ratio you're actually working with in your problem. So let's get into how do we tell which one to use. Okay, so how do we tell which one to use? So the opposite side is going to be located as the side that isn't creating your reference angle. So I have the theta here standing for the reference angle in our notes, and it's created by two lines. The third one that is not one of the two creating it is the opposite side. So what I recommend doing when you're doing one of these problems is find the two sides that create your angle, then the other side is the one that you should label opposite. And when you're getting used to these, start by actually writing that down. Label that side opposite. Actually do this and label that the opposite side. Then the next easiest thing to find is the 90-degree angle. Find the two sides that create the 90-degree angle. Okay, those are the two legs. There's a third side in the triangle that isn't one of those two. That's the one that's named the hypotenuse, okay? So again, in your notes, you could find the two sides that create the 90, and notice that the other side that is opposite from that is the hypotenuse, okay? So that's how you can get those. Once you have those two, then the other one must be the adjacent side. So once you figure out those two, you could call the other one the adjacent side, okay? Now you could just use an O, an H, and an A if you're too lazy to write down even 3 letters, but that's fine. You just need to know which one's which. Now, all you need to do to figure out which one you're using is circle the side that you know and the side you're trying to figure out. It's going to be 2 of the 3 sides, and as we discussed, each of these ratios is using 2 out of those 3 things. In this case, we're doing the opposite and the hypotenuse, so we check our notes. That can't be tangent because that doesn't use the hypotenuse. It can't be cosine because that one uses the adjacent and not the opposite. It is sine because that one uses the opposite and the hypotenuse. So that's how we know that we're using sine in this particular problem. If you had used a different 2, it would have been one of the other ones. Okay, so now that we've identified which thing to use, how do we actually use it? So now you're just going to write this down, sine theta equals opposite over hypotenuse, but you're actually going to fill in theta with your reference angle, and you're going to fill in the opposite and the hypotenuse with the values in your problem. So we write down sine, and theta is our reference angle, so that's going to be 25 degrees, and that is equal to the ratio of the opposite side divided by the hypotenuse. That is just a 10 divided by an x. Okay, now you just need to solve this equation for x and you're done. Now, as far as how to do that, there's several different ways to do this. One option is to leave everything written as sine 25 as you multiply and solve this problem. That's the most accurate method, but if you're just learning this for the first time, that might be a little bit confusing for you. So you might want to convert this into the actual ratio. So when you type in sine 25, now on different calculators, you might type in sine first, then the 25. And some, the order is different. On a phone, you might have to turn your phone sideways. And if you're using degrees, make sure your calculator's set to degrees. The point is, if you type in sine 25 and type it in correctly, you should get 0.42-ish, right? So this is basically about 0.42. Now, what does that actually mean? Your calculator is basically, when you press the sine button, you're telling your calculator that you're interested in the ratio between the opposite and the hypotenuse in a right triangle. When you type in the 25, you're telling your calculator that you specifically want the reference angle in that triangle to be a 25-degree angle. And now your calculator has enough information to identify a triangle that is similar to yours. It's not the same size, but it's the same shape and has the same ratios. That's what you're actually doing when you type that in. And when it gives you this 0.42, it's actually telling you that in its triangle, that like this could be its little thought bubble, right? This is your calculator's thought bubble, okay? This is what your calculator, here's your little calculator with all of its little buttons. This is what your calculator is thinking of when you press the sine button. You're telling it that you're thinking of the opposite divided by the hypotenuse, and you're giving it an angle to tell it what triangle you are similar to. Okay, that's what you're doing. You're actually looking up a similar triangle to yours. And when it gives you this 0.42, it's the ratio of the opposite divided by the hypotenuse. You could actually think about this as being a hypotenuse length of 1, and the opposite length is about 0.42. And so you could even think of this as two equal fractions. It's a similar triangle that has a hypotenuse of 1 and a opposite side of 0.42, and that is equal to your triangle, which has an opposite of 10 and a hypotenuse of x. And if you think about it like this, you might even be tempted to cross multiply. Cross multiplying is something that people are used to, and that's a valid way to solve these problems. You can just put a 1 on the bottom and cross multiply. Let's actually use that method. Again, there's lots of other ways that you could solve these. So if you're doing that, you would multiply the x times the 0.42, so 0.42x is now going to be equal to multiplying the other diagonal. And if you multiply the other diagonal, that would be the 1 times the 10. By the way, cross multiplying is just a shortcut. If you're not familiar with that, you probably are, but if you're not, it's just a shortcut for multiplying both sides by x and both sides by 1. It cancels off the side that it's on and ends up on the other side. That's all it is. Anyway, we have 0.42x equals 10, and we want to get x by itself. It's linked with multiplication to this number, so we can divide, which is the inverse operation, to get rid of that. And that's going to leave us with our final answer is x equals 10 divided by 0.42. Okay, well, 10 divided by, I'm going to, in my, I'll do 0.42. Okay, and that gets us about 23.8. So this is about 23.8, right? Did I see that right? Yeah, about 23.8. Now, like I said, you could, once you're more used to this, not convert the sine 25 into this decimal, and you could just leave that sine 25 there the entire time you're doing this. You could have just left sine 25 here. This would be sine 25x. You could then divide by sine 25 and actually type 10 divided by sine 25 in your calculator. That's going to be a little bit more accurate. So 10 divided by the sine of 25 is going to be a little bit more accurate because it used more decimal places of accuracy. Oh man, look, the actual answer should be more like x is about 23.6, was it 66? We'll do that, yeah, about 662. So notice that that's actually more accurate. But I think if you're learning this for the first time, it's probably easier to just put the decimal there and think about this as just two equal fractions and cross multiplying. All right, so that's the basic idea on how to do these. Let's do one more quick practice problem before we stop. Okay, so one more quick practice problem. Let's just make. I don't want to make this all completely go away. Let's just use some space up here. So I'm just going to make another triangle right here. And we'll take a quick look. So we've got a triangle. Remember, it needs to be a right triangle. You have to know what one of the angles is. Let's call it a 15-degree angle. And we're going to need to be looking for one of the sides. Let's call this one x. and we need to know what one of the other sides is. Let's call this one like 5. Okay, so let's run through the process quickly now that I've explained it. Basically, find the two sides that create your angle. The other one is the opposite side. You label that, okay? Then find the two sides that create your 90. The other one is your hypotenuse. Label that. The third side you haven't labeled yet is your adjacent side. Now, circle the side that you're looking for and the side that you know. That's going to tell you whether you're using sine, cosine, or tangent. This is opposite and adjacent, so we are using tangent, because if we look at tangent, that's opposite and adjacent. The other two don't use those. Okay, so for this problem, we're using tangent. Now you write down your problem, tangent, and remember we replace theta with the reference angle that we used. In this case, that was 15. And that is equal to the opposite over the adjacent. So in this case, that's going to be x over the 5. Again, I knew the x went on top because it's the opposite side, and that's what our notes say, right? That's how our calculator's programmed to think of this, so we have to align to that. Now we just need to solve this equation. Easiest way to do it is just multiply both sides by 5. If you wanted to cross multiply, you could put a 1 on the bottom here and do 1 times x is x equals 5 times tangent 15. You'll get the same answer. But this one would be easier if you just multiply both sides by 5. So let's think about it that way. So if we multiply both sides by 5, it's gone from this side. So we would get x is equal to 5 times tan 15. This time I'm showing you how it works when you don't round that to a decimal. It just looks like this. And then you type that in your calculator. So on my calculator, I would have to go 5 and then times. In mine, I do the angle first, then press tangent. Yours might be different. Okay, so I got 5 times tangent 15. And that comes out as about 1.3, well, I'll just call it about 1.34. Okay, that's it. That's the process. Hopefully this was useful to you, and I hope you have an excellent day.